And let's... Oh, apparently, maybe, looks like something's happening.
It's always very questionable. So I see there are a few people here. If somebody could just say, yes, we see you, or we hear you, it's okay. Because we never know for sure if we're really live until...
Well, apparently we are now.
Well, it shows us.
I think there's a bit of a 10-second delay is the issue. So you know, there's a satellite delay. Say hello if you're watching us, if you can see us, and if you can, we'll just dive straight in with our next thrilling installment. But we're not going to do this if we're just talking to ourselves. So if you can see us, let us know. Anybody?
There's a bunch of peeps here.
There are a bunch of peeps here, so I know it's going to take a moment or two for somebody to go diving to their computer and type some things in. Hi, we see you. Thank you so much. Perfect. All right. Who wants to start then?
Well, remember where we left off. Sally brought him tea, and she thought that maybe the beautiful lady could bring him some comfort.
Oh,
so now...
Say no more. Oh, look, we've got a ton of peeps here.
Chapter 8. Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. All right.
All right, Chapter 8. The arrangement was that as soon as I was fit again, I should ring up Miss LeFay Morgan at her hotel in Dickmouth and arrange a house hunting expedition. Are you okay?
Yes, I'm sorry. I apologise. That was just me straightening my feet and found a box under the table. So please continue.
What was that? Rock me gently.
I'm just trashing the joint. Please continue.
And believe it or not, I was as lively a grig.
Lively as a grig. I have no idea what a grig is, but there you go.
We're learning all kinds of new language. The next morning, I take it that means in fine fettle.
I may be so.
Instead of my usual laborious convalescence. However, I lay doggo for a bit because I wanted to do some quiet thinking. I had, in fact, quite a lot to think about.
Oh, indeed.
One of two things was obvious. Either Miss Morgan was telling the truth, or she wasn't. And supposing she weren't, what then?
Indeed.
Headley had already told us not to meddle in what was not our business, and given it as his opinion that we were unlikely to be involved if subsequent unpleasantness developed. At any rate, it was better to chance it rather than run our heads into an immediate hornet's nest, possibly get ourselves had up for libel.
Libel.
Oh, had up for libel, sorry.
I
read that as head up, and I was like, what is this about?
She has a funny term of phrase.
I think I'm too tired. And we didn't want to lose the business, sir.
Oh, excuse me. I apologise. I've just been out to close the greenhouse.
We're both
and
so
the
professional.
The elder is in full bloom. And he's definitely doing a number on Australia's. Right. Please, head up for libel and lose business.
Didn't want to accuse her of lying and not have the business. The argument appealed to Scotty, and he took a reef in his conscience.
Whatever a reef is, but he took one of them.
I don't think it's a spliff, but anyway.
That's such a different term of phrase 100 years ago.
The worst that could happen to us, even if Miss Morgan III had murdered Miss Morgan II, was that the judge would give us a piece of his mind at the trial. No one was likely to go to jail over it. Scotty simmered down after that, though he was always a smoldering volcano on the subject of Miss Morgan. Whatever her numbering, for he thought she was very, very bad for my morals and spiritualism, of which he soon came to suspect, though I swore it was archaeology, for I had to tell him a certain amount in order to make him keep quiet. He considered even worse for the soul being unnatural, whereas flagrant immorality is natural.
Well, there you go.
Anyway, what with one thing and another, it was a grief to Scotty, and we spoke of it as seldom as we could. So as far as I could make out, even if Miss Morgan turned out to be a liar and a vamp and a general adventuress...
Adventuress?
Adventuress.
What a word is that?
I did not see that I could come to a very grievous harm in her hands, even if I did not part with my money, well, at least, not more than I could comfortably spare, for one expects to pay for one's fun within reason. And even if she were all that Scotty said she was, I was going to have the time of my young life.
Well, there you go.
In fact, I was going to have the time of my young life if she were half of what Scotty thought she was, and I thought I was due for it, having a pretty lean season up to that point. Hereto.
Heretofore. What a fancy name, eh? Should I continue?
Oh, yes, please.
All right then. If, of course, what she said was the truth, as I more than half felt it to be, well, then we were in for big things.
Then something even weirder's happening.
So I decided to have something on Miss Morgan both ways. I was entirely game for an adventure in the fourth dimension, and if that did not materialise, if that is the right word to use in this connection, I was not averse to a reasonable amount of vamping. Excuse us. So I got up around noon next day and crawled into my office, trying to look debilitated, for I had never felt so full of life. Or full of go in my life, and began to shuffle over the lists of suitable residences in the Dickmouth and Starbuck neighbourhoods that may fit the bill for Miss LeFay Morgan. When Scotty learnt what I was doing, he sniffed portentously, but ceased to rumble. Business is business in Scotland. She wanted something isolated, with large rooms and a basement.
A basement, curious.
That wasn't overlooked, and as near to the sea as possible. In fact, a sea view from some windows at any rate was indispensable. I cursed when I thought of the white elephants I had practically given away with a pound of tea that would have suited her just nicely. Basements and isolation spell the servant problem in large letters, and you pretty nearly have to pay people to live in houses of that description. I had seriously thought of times of driving round the Morgan estate, chucking cans of petrol and cigarette ends through the windows.
God almighty.
It would have been an economy in the long run. Then I suddenly realised that we had the very thing she wanted, though. Scotty cursed me for not letting sleeping white elephants lie and selling us someone else's property and making a bid on the deal. For in fact, not only had we had it, but she had it. Okay. Out beyond Dickmouth, on the far side of the River Dick, was a big headland running right out into the sea for over a mile. At the end of it was a dismantled fort that the War Office had abandoned to the jackdaws as out of date, and that my pater had picked up for Morgan Estate as a bargain. He thought it would make a fine hotel, with golf links on the down behind it, but he omitted to inquire about the water supply before he bought it, and when he found that it depended on rain water tanks, he knew it was a non-starter as a hotel. It might do for a couple of dozen Tommies who didn't wash over much, but it was no use for the grand imperial palace he had in mind. So he wrote it off as a total loss and did no more about it, except to let the rabbiting to whoever wanted it. And when the farm at the landward end became derelict, no one wanted it because it was too far from anywhere. So I made up my mind to take Miss Morgan at her face value, plant one of her own white elephants on her and get a bit of fun out of life in general, and leave Scotty to pray for my soul if it needed it.
How's he going to sell it to her if she already owns it?
Well, I guess he's not, is he? I threw myself wholeheartedly into the adventure, feeling it was a heads I won and tails I couldn't lose much. Rang up Miss Morgan on the phone and told her the special providence was watching over her, which she seemed to believe, and the priest of the moon had gotten his temple all fixed up and waiting for her. I asked her to get a luncheon basket from the hotel, for I did not see myself explaining matters to my sister, who would certainly have considered Miss LeFay Morgan long past picnicking, and arranged to call for her next morning bright and early and take her to see the temple of the Lord had provided.
But as soon as I set eyes on her, I could have kicked myself for the way I'd been thinking of her. whatever she might or might not be when judged by conventional standards, and the friend of South American presidents was not likely to be very conventional. She was no fraud. I knew that. She was absolutely sincere. And if what she said wasn't true, it was not because she was lying, but because she was hallucinating.
Oh, nice.
I was wondering how she was going to manage her high-heeled shoes if I couldn't get to the car all the way to the front of the fort. But when she came out of the hotel, I saw she had changed them for a more substantial pair, which, though they looked useful, were nevertheless streamlined. Apparently it was possible for a woman to get a workmanlike shoe that was high cut on the lines of a canal barge, though my sister said it wasn't. She had also changed into loose, blankety sort of coat in a gray-green with a big, fluffy, upstanding collar of light-colored fur. Over the top of it, you could see her eyes, but no more. Apparently no one ever did see Miss LaFay Morgan's face in the open street. There was a queer, unusual kind of smartness about the whole kit. I could see the loungers in the sun parlor watching. I had never before had the experience of being the escort of a woman whom other men obviously coveted. And if there were any lingering...
Languidness?
Languidness.
Lingering languidness. Try saying that
left
3
over
times.
from my attack, it effectually tonicked it. She was very charming and very friendly. But what with wanting to kick myself for the way I had been feeling and pride of possession at being seen with her, I was off my social stroke for a moment and very much the auctioneer, for which I could have kicked myself again with compound interest. But these things are like asthma. The more you strain them, the tighter they jam. Anyway, she took her cue from me and drew in her horns, and I jumped to the conclusion that I had wrecked the outing and shut up completely. Although we could see Bellhead lying like a stranded whale on the far side of the bay, I had to drive nearly back to Dickford before we could make for it, for the ferry at the river's mouth didn't take cars. However, presently we came to the swing bridge that lets through the coasters bringing coal and got across into the marshes. You.
Here the land changed, and with it my mood, for this was the country I'd seen in my dream when I first met Morgan Le Fay. If that were whom she really was, as I half suspected. At our backs lay the long ridge on the furthermost spur of which Dickford was built, taking advantage of the first firm ground and the lowest ford. All old towns have their situations chosen for them by necessity, and it amused me, going about the country as my work took me, to try and determine why a hamlet stood in a particular place, or a road ran as it did. One could trace the end of the furthermost shelf of the ridge under the soil by the line of farms that followed the line of springs. The part of the marsh was divided up by high dikes and water cuts, and in the unwholesomely green grass cattle were grazing. But as we got further along, the dikes ceased and the land was given over to those it belonged to, the waterfowl and the old gods.
The old gods.
Only the road was diked now, and in the roadside ditches stood herons that didn't give a damn for us. They saw so little traffic they didn't know what it meant, and they thought if they froze, as they were accustomed to, we couldn't see them any more than the fish could. Suddenly, the blue devils that were on me departed, and I turned to Miss Morgan. I said, "This is where I had to pilot you with fog flares the first time you came." I couldn't see whether she smiled or not inside her great furry collar, but her voice came all deep and golden. "You remember that then?" "Maybe," said I, and concentrated on my driving, for I had stampeded myself with my own remark. Having so little to do with women, I am apt to be either crudely brusque or much too formal. Anyway, the driving needed concentrating on, for we were now on a narrow, grass-grown track on a 10-foot dike,
Aye.
and I had no wish to join the herons. Away on our left, Bell Knoll rose in a perfect pyramid from the wide waste of the marches. Fir trees grew in the folds on its side, but its crest was bare to the winds and rather noble. Seen over that level land, I pulled up and pointed out the hollow that in my opinion held the old sea cave, and from the vantage point that even a 10-foot rise gives in these alluvial flats, I traced for Miss Morgan the shallow winding ditch marked by the gleam of standing water here and there in its bottom, which was all that was left of my ancient river Dick before it changed its course and drowned the monastery. She naturally wanted to turn aside and inspect it, being a woman. Oh, sorry, did you want to go now?
It's my turn.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Pray continue. Pray continue.
We're just on it tonight, I say.
I say. Say no more.
She naturally wanted to turn aside and inspect it, being a woman, but it was impossible to do so, as there was no bridge over the water cuts nearer than Starber, 3 miles further on, and the next coastal town to Nickmouth, if town it could be called. It was really nothing but a fishing village these days. Once it had been a haven for some dimensions, and was listed in Doomsday Book as such.
No, hey.
For the scour of the Dick kept the harbour open, but when the river shifted, the glory departed, and now only such boats as could be beached made use of it. Behind the town, however, were traces of long lines of masonry that had once been massive quays, but had long since been used as a quarry to build and pave the entire district, and only the trenches marked by the footings now remained. My father had bought up the last of them and built quite a lot of his white elephants out of that stone, and when I remembered going out with him as a kid in his dog cart before motors had reached the likes of us, and seeing the enormous blocks being split with wedges before they could be handled. It was
Cyclopean masonry.
Cyclopean masonry, all right. And the cement, wafer thin, was of such tenacity that it was easier to split the stone than to join. If I knew the secret of that cement, I would have made a fortune. We have nothing like that today. I mentioned this to Miss Morgan, and I heard her laugh. Do you know that Starber is Ishtar's beer or harbor? That was the place I was making for when you nearly let me run on a sandbank because you were daydreaming then, as you do today. I'm frightfully sorry, I said. I'm not half as loopy as I look. I'm not really, when you get to know me. Do you ever let anyone get to know you? She said.
Chapter 9. The embankment carried the road across the shallow groove of the ancient Dick, paying the tribute of a drain pipe that once was a navigable stream. Here we could see distinctly the remains of what had evidently been the old towpath, trodden, I expect, by the feet of slaves when the unhandy sea-boats lowered their lateen sails and were towed up the winding waterway through the marshes to Dickford, where they met the tin men from the hills behind the ridge. Taking advantage of the banked path, a narrow track turned off towards the sea, and this we followed, for it brought us up by a winding way to the derelict farm at the foot of Bell Head, also Miss Morgan's property. We looked at it over the fallen dry stone wall that separated its narrow yard from the wide marsh. At some time it had been whitewashed, as is the custom hereabouts, but the whitewash was gone, save for a leprous patch here and there, and the stones were as grey as the salt marsh grass. The house was low and squat and box-like, such as a small child that had no talent might draw on a slate. There were no signs of a garden, but a patch of ranker growth showed where the manure heap had been, ominously close to the back door.
Ew.
You can tell the grade of a tenant by his sanitary arrangements better than by anything else, but the steep, grassy slope that led up to the face of the rock behind the house showed the dints and ridges of cultivation. Bell Head was shaped like a couchant lion, with his tail to the sea, and the farm lay between his paws, getting what shelter it might from the westerly gales. The slope that led up to the lion's chest had some time been terraced, though the plough of more recent operations had gone over the terraces before they'd been given back to the thistles and slow-growing sea-down grass. Wow.
That's a tough one to say.
Miss Morgan remarked at once on the lion form, and pointing to the terraces between its paws said, "That was where they grew their vines." "Who?" said I, taken aback. "The people who use Balnol as a temple. I will grow vines there again if I come back here." We came now into a road that was the work of the War Department, and had been laid out in the simple expedient of drawing a line on a map with a ruler and leaving fatiguing Tommies to hack it out at their leisure.
This line was carried diagonally across the steep pitch of the landward end of the head of the ledge. And at the hairpin bend at the top, I feared the car was going to roll over backwards. I thought of the Tommies toiling up here with their supplies before the days of motor lorries and felt sorry for them. After that one soul-searing bend, the road ran straight again for the full length of the headland till it dipped out of sight at the point. Above us, the crest of the down, were many loose piles of stones like cairns, in which Miss Morgan was interested, but I would not let her stay off to look at them, but then drove straight ahead through the 10 million skipping rabbits till we came to the dip of the road and saw the fort. Miss Morgan began to bubble with excitement at my side. It was a small place, sunk to protect it from gunfire, and built of the local limestone by the same unimaginative architect who had laid out the road with a ruler. The rotting gate was off its hinges, and we drove straight into the forecourt. Behind us were the barracks, in front a semicircle of gun emplacements, ahead a long tongue and half-tide rock ran out into the water, and one had only to look at the people and swirl around the point to know they were the tides that ran on still to this day. In stormy weather, I should imagine the waves made a clean beach of it. Miss Morgan took one look around and pronounced the place her ideal. I thought of what life must have been like here for the poor goddamn Tommies, and carried the luncheon basket to a sheltered gun emplacement. Miss Morgan, however, would not settle down to the lunch yet. She climbed up an
Embrasure. Fancy word, eh?
I don't know what that is, but anyway. And walked out to the end of a long razorback split that ran 50 or 60 feet into the water and stood at the very edge of the oncoming waves, gazing out to sea. I was uneasy about her, for if she had skidded on the barnacle stones, nothing could have saved her, with the tide running like a mill race. So I called to her to come on, look at the bathing beach. She didn't answer. But I stood there a while. I smoked 3 cigarettes, giving back a step at a time before advancing waves, for the tide was rising. In her gray-green blanket coat, she was exactly the same color as the sea, hardly distinguishable from it, as she stood there in a half-light of the gray day, and the loose folds of her coats flapping like a flag in the wind. Then she took off her hat, pulled a carved tortoiseshell comb out of her hair, and shook loose like a flying black mane. I watched her, fascinated, much more fascinated than I thought I ought to have been. I had never met a woman who behaved like this before. I smoked that second cigarette pretty fast. However, I had simmered down by the time I had smoked the third, and as I thought that she had stood there long enough, leaning up against the wind with her hair flying and her clothes blowing, I climbed down, intending to help her back up the rocks.
She turned and put out her hand. I thought it was to steady herself for the climb back, so I took it, but no. She drew me down to stand beside her on the narrow point and kept hold of me. "Come and feel the sea," she said. I stood silently beside her, leaning up against the pressure of the wind as she had done. It was not cold, but a warm and glowing wind that wrapped you round with a strong pressure. At our feet there was a perpetual slapping of small ripples, and further out a steady boom swish as the breakers hit the rocks. It was fascinating. The sea, deep and in its strength, was all around us, save for that narrow knife edge of wave-swept rock that stretched away back to the fort. I gave myself up to the glamour of it, standing there beside her. Then I noticed a thing I have noticed before when listening to waves breaking on rocks. The sound of the bells in the water.
Bells?
It is, of course, an illusion produced by the noise, a kind of reverberation within the ear itself, fatigued by the rhythmical din. I can only compare it to the sound one would hear if the song of the sea in a shell had a throb in it. I listened, fascinated, and as I listened, it lost its elusive wind in a shell quality and became a definite beat. And then a brazen clamour coming up from the very depths, as if they were opening upon the sea palaces. Then I was suddenly aroused by a voice in my ear. "My dear boy, wake up, or you will fall in." I turned, startled, to find Miss LeFay Morgan beside me, still holding my hand. We climbed back over the steep, slippery ledges. I admit I looked over my shoulder to see if the sea gods were following. It seemed to me at that moment when her voice interrupted me, I had stood at the place where two kingdoms meet, and the gates of the sea kingdom were being opened to me. I suppose, in other words, that meant drowning, and I should have gone by that cold path to join the sea people if Miss LeFay Morgan had not aroused me. Then we had lunch, and I drove her home. I was glad she liked the place, for I felt it had been a washout as a companion on an expedition. As we parted outside her hotel, for I would not come in and have tea with her, she suddenly put her hand on my arm and said, "When will you realise that I have no ulterior motive in trying to make friends with you?"
I was so taken aback that I couldn't think of a word to say, and could not have trusted my voice to say it if I had. I muttered something ungracious and fled. I would have left my garment in her grasp like the biblical gentleman if she had hung on. On the way home I was stopped by a local traffic cop who said that if he had not known it was me, he would have run me in. He asked me what possessed me to drive like that. Was it something the doctor had given me for my asthma? I said it might have been, and he advised me, as one man to another, to put up with the asthma.
Oh my. Should we continue?
Yeah, I think we could do chapter 10, because it's a
well,
little...
you just started, so you should continue.
It's a little... it's not too big. But
we'll get chapter 10, and I think we can.
Yeah. I have always been a notable exponent of what is called doorstep wit. That is to say, all the admirable things one thinks of as the door shuts behind one, and that might have been said with such telling effect if one had only thought of it earlier. I have the additional disadvantage that the mechanism does not work impartially with me. For when my temper rouses, I have a quick and bitter tongue, often to my lasting regret. But when I am moved emotionally and would particularly like to respond, I am a dumb dog. I could not expect Miss Morgan to persevere in the face of my boorishness. It was a most odd thing. The very companion I had wanted to go to London to seek had sought me out here, after I had abandoned all hope of it, and yet here I was, turning it down with both hands so persistently as to leave no possible doubt in anyone's mind as to what my apparent feelings might be, whatever were my real ones. I made up my mind that when next I expected to meet Miss Morgan, I would have a couple of drinks and see if that would loosen up my inhibitions.
Better watch out for that cop again.
The drinks and the asthma medicine, right? One consolation, however, remained to me. Miss Morgan had changed me with the task of transforming the fort into human habitation, for the place where a pre-war government kept Tommies could hardly be reckoned as that. So in any case, I must see her again, not once but several times, and I pinned my hopes on the fact that I might get a little tamer as the novelty wore off. I cast about for a firm-to-do job. I did not want to use our usual contractors, as I did not want the gossip. Finally, I lit upon a quaint old boy, well known locally for church repairs. A highly specialized form of building, and one for which there is considerable scope round your way, for we have some lovely village churches. This old boy,
Bindling or Bindling?
Bindling?
I don't know. Either or.
I think it's Bindling.
Bindling by name.
Bindling by name used to load all of his gear, his 3 old workmen, which were all he had, and his idiot son into a huge hay cart with a couple of hairy old horses to pull it, and set out for the job in any of 4 counties.
I think he's old school.
They walked up all the hills and they walked down all the hills, so they took their time to arrive after the contract was signed, and when they got there, they never hurried. But then, on the other hand, they never stopped. So in the end, they got through as soon, and sometimes sooner, than a more orthodox and up-to-date contractor.
The idiot's son was an inspired carver, and though they had to tether him to the scaffolding to prevent him coming down the quickest way when the whistle went, which consisted of stepping off into thin air, he really was the backbone of the business.
The idiot's son?
Well, he's an inspired carver, apparently.
Apparently.
Old Bingling trundled out to the fort, arriving there in the course of a week or 10 days. How he ever got up that army road and round the hairpin bend, God only knows, but he did. The fort had been built to withstand gunfire, so no structural repairs were needed. But of course, there wasn't a pane of glass left in the windows or a door on its hinges, thanks to trippers. And there was something dead in the water supply.
Ew.
It turned out only to be a jackdaw in the end, but you would never have believed one miserable bird could have gone so far or got so high.
Bleh.
Yeah. I can do an architect's work, though I have never taken an architect's degrees. So I got the place measured up while Mr. Bindling and his party finished with the jackdaw, whom we're all convinced must be at least a sheep. Taking turns at the job, one down, t'other come on, the idiot son standing at the atmosphere best. He had some remarkable qualities, had that youth, for all he lacked in other directions. I wanted to transform a place that looked like a jail into a temple for my sea priestess.
Oh, he's calling her my sea priestess.
As I called Miss Morgan behind her back, lacking the nerve to call it to her face, though I'm sure she would have liked it. I not got an easy job on hand, for to stick ornamentation to that grim stone structure was useless. It would merely look like a tipsy deacon in a paper cap. I turned over many books dealing with architecture all over the world. Miss Morgan never knew how near she came to getting an Aztec temple to live in, and finally lit on one that struck the right tone and drew my inspiration therefrom. It was an old monastery in the Apennines that had become the villa of a rich American, and the architect had done his job well, retaining the original stark severity, but breaking it by the line of his windows and softening it with a pergola. I roughed out my ideas and saw the fort would take them kindly. Then I worked up a scale drawing and sent it off to Miss Morgan, who of course had long since returned to London. She sent back a letter that made me feel warm for a week. I know when I saw your room that you are an artist, but I did not know that you were such an artist as this. Ooh, warm and fuzzy feelings, eh?
Needless to say, I returned thanks on the post office paper in the covering letter to an estimate I would. It was obviously impossible to follow my model slavishly, and have a creeper-covered pergola. Any creeper except ivy would have gone out to sea with the first windy night, and ivy would have taken a generation, possibly two, to cover the pergola in that situation. So I turned to and designed a stone-built pergola covered in carved sea plants and queer sea beasts. I nearly lost my life off the point of a rock trying to fish up a giant focus to act as a model. Fucus?
I have no idea what that is. Probably some sea creature.
Old Bindling, who caught me by the collar as I skidded towards the deep water, told me that every place that I intended for a sacred edifice, even the humblest little Bethel, always demands a life in its building.
Oh dear.
That is why he repairs churches, but won't ever build them. He little knew that he was preparing a temple for the sea gods at this present moment, and it was the second time they had come dashed near to having my life. Uplifted by previous appreciation, I took a lot of trouble with the designs for the carvings on the pergola, and felt rather pleased with them when I finally packed them off to Miss Morgan by registered post where she was holiday making on the continent. But not only did she write back even more warmly than before, she showed them to someone she knew, and they reproduced it in an art journal. Then she had them framed. She never knew it, but I had to do it, the dashed lot, all over again out of my head from the idiot Bindling to work from. Of course, I did not do the second lot in as much detail as the first. Anyway, it was a labor of love, which I worked off some of the libido that had got disassociated by the various bricks I had dropped in my dealings with her. I had broken the grim line of existing building by putting Gothic arches to all the windows. The entrance to the fort was by most giddy-making plank bridge that spanked no end of a moat. And really efficient affair. I replaced the rotting timbering with a lovely little round arch stone bridge copied from one in Cumberland that I had seen on a walking holiday before I had my asthma. Into the tunnel-like entrance that passed under the officers' quarters, I gave access to the courtyard, and which I Gothicked.
Gothicked. He made it Gothic as well.
Gothicked.
Yes.
Interiorly, as I couldn't do it to the exterior without bringing the bally place down on our heads. I put enormous double doors of oiled oak, copied from the cathedral, and decorated with some fine wrought iron hinges, which I had made with the help of our local blacksmith. He's doing a lot of work.
This is not cheap. This is not a cheap gig. I hope she's got plenty of money.
For my own designs, and as a nice bit of genuine craftsmanship, if I may say so, as anyone could wish to see. Getting this job done gave the show away to a certain extent, and my sister was on it like a hawk. But the special providence which I had
ragged Miss Morgan.
Oh, he ragged her. What's that mean?
I don't know. It's
to watch over us.
Yeah.
The hinges were borrowed from local arts and crafts exposition and then borrowed from London one, so a slight cloud of glory spread over the family, and my sister, who had no fault to find with my goings-on, believing Miss Morgan to be rising 90, forgave me for telling her nothing. "Has Miss Morgan still got all of her faculties?" she asked one day. "She seems all right to me," I said. "But Scotty thinks she's frail." So he did, but not in the way they took it.
After that, they became reconciled to my being more and more out at the fort, going there nearly every day, in fact. I found the sea air was doing wonders for my asthma, which they also observed, so altogether fate was playing into my hands. Not that I ever placed too much reliance in that temperamental goddess, for she has always had a knack of leading me on and then giving me away. I suppose that is inevitable in a place where everybody knows everybody, that is riddled with poachers, and where all the courting is done under hedges. What the poachers miss, the loving couples see, and as both parties, owing to the nature of their activities, are obliged to keep a sharp lookout, not much passes unnoticed. I've finally come to the conclusion that frankness is the better part of discretion in this district, though I have no conscientious objection whatever to telling lies to people who inquire about what does not concern them. I suppose that comes of being educated at our local academy for the sons of gents, where the first thing one learnt, and the only thing one learnt thoroughly, was to extricate oneself from difficulties with the aid of the imagination. Being, as Miss Morgan said, an artist, and in more ways than she knew of, I excelled at this. I had been a Pukka Sahib with an old school tie. It might have been otherwise, but one needs considerable capital to achieve honour without martyrdom, and all our capital was tied up in the family business. It is a curious thing, however, that though my sister has called me a liar times without number, she has never caught me out, having always pitched on the wrong thing owing to her limited knowledge of human nature. Recently, I have not bothered so much whether they knew things or not, my newly acquired temper protecting me. All my life long, till I developed asthma, I had been a mother's boy. Then, with the coming of the asthma, I broke out. It is said that the gods always make you pay the price for any great blessing. But in my case, having sent me a pretty unmitigated curse, they funded up handsomely in other directions. I can honestly say, with my hand on my heart, what's left of it, that if I had had the chance to choose between being an asthmatic or a mother's boy for the rest of my life, and having tried both, I would choose to be an asthmatic. My family took it hard, however, when I began telling them to go to hell. It was like being bitten by a rabbit.
We worked on the fort all the summer, and I must say it was a success. For the landward side, it looked like the remains of a ruined abbey, for it had pointed windows, but not the pointed roof. The roof was flat, and would throw off the water in order to give minimum resistance to the wind, and most of the slates having gone to the glory long ago, I roofed it with split stone like a Cotswold cottage, and it looked rather well. The 3 gun embrasures had shallow semicircular steps leading up to them, and low
balustrades. Yes,
It's
balustrades like a parapet
feature, yeah. All caned with seahorses and other queer beasts that I had made a stair and path down to the point of the rocks, balustered as far as I dare, for I had no wish to have Miss Morgan skidding off into the deep water as I had nearly done. I had also made a delightful winding balustrade balcony leading down to the bathing beach, a little cove looking out to sea just under the lee of the headland. It was here that driftwood came ashore in surprising quantities. I did not think Miss Morgan would ever need to cart coal if she cooked with oil, as I expected she would. Whenever the idiot had nothing else to do, we put him on to fishing out the driftwood to keep him out of our mischief. If he were not kept busy, he was given to setting things on fire.
Oh, dear.
I wanted to get a good stock of driftwood well dried out again for Miss Morgan's arrival, for I thought it would rather be nice for my sea priestess to have a genuine sea fire to welcome her, for the blue flame of the salt-soaked wood is so beautiful.
I just pictured that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I put navvies to work on the hairpin bend and took the worst of the venom out of it, though it was still pretty tricky, and we got the furniture vans up without accident, though I admit there was plenty of cursing. Miss Morgan sent a man and his wife to take charge of the farm. Cornish folk. The square kind, as broad as they are long, as thick as they are wide. I could see they both adored her. It was to be their job to look after the place. They were to live at the farm, and to trundle out and to do what was required at the fort, and then trundle back when they had finished. And Miss Morgan told me to get them a car to trundle in, as it was all of a mile and a bit over. The car for the job had to be considered carefully, and there was no making a chauffeur in Trithowen. It was too much. I knew to expect him to change gear.
I knew it was too much. I knew to expect him to change gear.
Oh, like he couldn't drive out that road. So although he had the power to get up the gradient, I didn't want him to give the car that would get away with him. Finally, I found an old ancient Ford with the original vintage that could shin up the telegraph pole, a high hump-backed two-seater with a hood, though they could never use the hood on the headland except in fine weather.
You want me to go?
Yeah.
It was the funniest sight you ever saw to see them trundling along in this Trioen and his missus in front. All the brooms and brushes pushed in behind. He went bucketing along at a spanking 10, hooting at the rabbits. He loved hooting. I had to get him a new hooter as soon as he bust the old one. He never went any faster, even on the flat, but he never went any slower, even on the bend. So to see him swing that hairpin bend at 10 miles an hour was a sight to make your blood run cold. They soon got the place more or less shipshape, though of course the finishing touches had to wait for Miss Morgan. All my part of the job was done, and I was out at the fort for the last time, bustling old Bindling into his hay cart, for Miss Morgan had wired to say she would be arriving that afternoon. And he ought to have been out the previous day, but builders have been the same since the Tower of Babel fell down on them, fell down on them, though they're stopping stopping to talk. There was only one train she could come by, which would get her into Dickmouth at 5:15. Then she would have an hour's drive out to the fort, so I reckoned I had ample time in hand to do my getaway before she was due. And taking a last look around the place before leaving it, I had practically lived there all summer, bringing food out with me till the Trioens arrived. Sorry, get their name right. And then they made my meals, and only sleeping at home, a God-sent relief. Taking a last look at everything I had done, I felt like a mother whose child goes out into the world. I think that as creative artists, authors have the best of it. For an author does not lose his book when it is published, but an artist has to give up his picture to the purchaser, and even a composer is dependent upon the interpretation of the performer. As for an architect, poor devil, he puts his soul and infinite research into a period house, and the purchasers go and paint it pink. I heard no sound to give the warning, as was mooing round in my leisure, saying goodbye to the seahorses and other queer beasts I had brought into existence, when a little black sports car drove in under the archway, and there was Miss Morgan.
I was so taken aback that I simply grinned from ear to ear and said, "Hello," which is not the way the best house agents greet their clients. "Hello, how are you?" she said, smiling at me with her collar. I had been wondering all summer how she would manage about collars in the warm weather, and whether she would be driven to appear in public in her bare face, but not a bit of it. She managed all right. She had got on a silk raincoat with a big stand-up storm collar that came to the tips of her ears, and a ragamuffin slouch hat that was pulled down to meet it, so she was just as private and secluded as ever. Luckily for me, there was no need for any more effort at politeness on my part, for I had shot my conventional bolt with the one hello. Out came the Tethoans, beaming a welcome, and then Mr. Bindling had to be introduced and the idiot's son chased off. I took on the risk of heading off the idiot's son, while the old boy did the polite, for the poor moon calf was determined not to be left out of it. But as he dribbled profusely and had other even less endearing traits, he could not very well be invited very far into it. However, the old foreman came to the rescue and pressed the boat hook into his hand, and put him to fish for the driftwood and the steps leading down to the rocks. As the tide was high, the minute he saw the driftwood, he forgot all about Miss Morgan, so everybody was happy. Old Bindling and I showed her around, and she was delighted and delightful. I saw him trying hard to peer under her hat over the collar, but nothing doing. The fort consisted of the officers' quarters at one end, or whomever the person might be who was in charge of that godforsaken detachment, and the great gaunt barrack room on the other. Knowing that there would not be many days that exposed spot when one could sit out in comfort, I had made the barrack room into a sun parlor. There's no sun.
There is sun.
By fitting it with the shop windows right across the front. The barrack room stove, when it was pulled up by the roots, left behind it a crevice big enough for an inglenook, so I had fitted it accordingly. That's a big stove,
I guess,
with a wide brick hearth and 2 seats in the angles. For burning driftwood, she wanted fire dogs, not a grate. So people won't even know what that is. Fire dogs.
It's like a kind of like a rudimentary fire thing, rather than just like a grate. You've got like 2 bars that hold your logs on them, so it's very open fire.
So I designed her a noble pair of fire dogs and had them cast at a Bristol foundry. She hadn't commissioned them, but I hoped she would accept them as a present. Strictly speaking, I suppose they were not fire dogs, being dolphins, fine, fat, pleasant-faced beasts, sitting up on their curly tails like a couple of cobra. My sister's Pekingese had been the model for the heads. They were being duly admired, and I was addling my brain as to how I would break it to Miss Morgan that they were a present so she didn't pay for them, and feeling hot and cold all over and wishing to God I had let well alone, when something caught the tail of my eye through the big expanse of the plate glass on the one side of the room, and I turned to see the idiot Bindling, who had come off the steps where he had left but not tethered, gaily glumping on his shuffle feet over the slippery rock. No time to explain, so I just bolted.
But even so, I was not quick enough, for as I jumped down onto the rock, I was just in time to see the youth's face go from under him. The youth's feet go from under him on the treacherous slope, and he sat down with a smack and went tobogganing down the steep pitch, with a blissful smile on his foolish face, and plopped straight into the sea. And we never saw him again, nor his hat,
God,
nor anything belonging to him. I tore off my coat and started after him. It was an idiotic thing to do, for there wasn't the remotest chance of getting him. Luckily for me, the foreman, who had sprinted up when he saw what was happening, threw his arms around me and stopped me. "No good throwing your life away for the likes of he said. The others climbed down and stood horror-stricken, gazing at the spot where the poor moon calf had vanished and no trace left. Old Bingling slowly raised his hat, not in reverence, but in order to scratch his head. "Well, I don't know what to say," he said at length, and slowly replaced his hat again. "Maybe it's just as well," said the old foreman. "Maybe 'tis," said the old father. "But blood's thicker than water." I was shaking all over, but Miss Morgan was utterly unmoved. She was very sweet to poor old Bindling, and it was a cold-blooded kind of sweetness that gave me a very queer feeling. I remembered the old man's words that a temple always demands a life in its building. Well, this one had had it. 3 times the sea gods had tried for me, and now they had got it. I remembered that in my dream I had known that the sea priestess had required many human victims.
It's terribly sad.
Miss Morgan tried to find me a drink but couldn't, and offered me tea, but I wouldn't stop. I wanted to go home. I had had a thorough shake-up, what with the shock of the poor moon calf and my, I had to admit, quite illogical revulsion of feeling against Miss Morgan. It was no fault of hers that the moon calf fell in, if fault there were. It was mine, who hadn't fenced that rock more securely. All the time I had a queer feeling that it was the thing behind her that had shaken him. She did not press me to stop when she saw I really did not want to, but walked out with me to my car to see me off. And then the damn thing wouldn't start. We'd been using the headlights to work by the previous evening and the battery was down. These are the occasions to which swearing cannot do justice. If I had had a grain of sense, I would have called Trithoen to start her for me, but I am always forgetting I have asthma, though unfortunately asthma never forgets it has me. I put my weight, what there is of it, behind the starting handle and gave her a couple of heaves, and then I knew I was for it. I leant up against the wing of the car and prayed, but it was no good. And as I sat down on the running board, Miss Morgan called Trithoen, and his wife came running. Fortunately, he had seen my asthma before and was able to reassure her that what for me and the moon calf, the poor soul was having an unpleasant afternoon. I am not a nice sight when I have these bouts, and I am always torn between a dislike of being watched and a dislike of being left alone.
They got me indoors and wanted to put me on the sofa, but I wouldn't. I can always manage better in a chair on these occasions. They put me in a huge armchairs whose legs Miss Morgan had not yet had time to saw off. I wondered how she would get on, for there were not only the phone, and the doctor would be hard to come by. I reckoned I would have to make up my mind to thrash through it without morphia. The actual attack itself, in its acute form, does not usually last more than a couple of hours with me, but they can be a pretty long 2 hours. The Trithoens wanted to make Miss Morgan a meal for after her journey, but she wouldn't have it. She just stood and looked at me, and it was all she could do. Poor soul. "I wish I could help you," she said. It was very sweet of her, and I appreciated it enormously, but as usual was unable to make any response this time from my physical cause. I heard her mutter, "This is terrible," and realized she wasn't as cold-blooded as she looked. She wandered about in the big room and then came back to me. "I would give anything to be able to help you," she said, but there was nothing to be done. I just had to go through with it. Then, before I realized what she was doing, she sat down on the arm of the chair and put her arm around me and tried to take my head to her shoulders, but I couldn't let her because I knew my perspiration would make a mess of her frock. She didn't press it when she felt me resist, and then, of course, I wished I hadn't, and I felt damn sick with myself for missing my chance. But presently I reached a point where not only my pride went, but my shyness too, and I turned around and leant up against her, and very comforting it was. The only drawback being that it gave me a taste for that sort of thing, and whenever I had an attack since, I wanted her so desperately. Presently, I don't know. I think I was pretty nearly insensible towards the end, and there comes a point when nature in her own aesthetic. Nature is her own anesthetic. The attack wore off, and I dropped off to sleep. So Scotty's prophecy came true. I slept with Miss Morgan, though it was not the way he meant.
And we're up to chapter 11. Look at that. Well, that was an hour.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a right riveting read, this.
If you can understand it, good God.
Well, no, this is good
you
because
need an interpreter.
Well, we're doing all right. You know, you're a pretty good Anglo whatever. You can figure stuff out.
Oh.
You can. What even? I'm English, but there's even stuff in here which is like.
You need an interpreter for.
Well, you have to understand that this is written in the 30s. It's almost
100 years ago.
Old. It's almost 100 years old. So this would have been like written in sort of young people's colloquial.
We ain't up with the slang of the times.
We ain't down with the kids from the 30s, are we?
No.
You know what I'm saying?
No.
It's like whatever vamping is. Vamping. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I understand vamping was like you would play a solo, but you would like, you know. Well, that's kind of scatting in jazz, isn't it? But that's still vamping. If you like bounce all over the place, that's like vamping it out.
I think it had sexual connotation in the
I think it might have done.
Yeah.
I think it might have done.
That she was a tramp.
Say no more.
A trampy, vampy tramp.
I don't think she's much of a tramp.
No.
No. So there you go.
All right.
If you like what we do, send us lots of money.
They did send us money, so we...
Send us more money. We need more money.
All right. Thank you, people.
No.
Enjoy yourselves. We're going to go have a bite to eat and then off
we
to
should
bed.
really, isn't it? Because, we got places to see and people to go tomorrow. So that's what we're going to do. So thank you for joining us. Have yourselves a wonderful evening. And we'll catch you next time for the next thrilling instalment of The Sea Priestess. Take care. Night now.